Welcome back to 1001 Nights of Reading the World. I'm Mike, and today is pretty much a sequel to the last video I made because Samarkand by Amin Maalouf, a Lebanese-born author, is about pretty much all the same characters, historic events, works that I talked about in my last video. And I'm not exaggerating this. I basically just read two versions of the same story told from different perspectives, 50 years apart in different fictional formats. So I will elaborate. But I think just right off the bat, I want to say I think that Samarkand, I'm just so grateful for having read this because it really did a lot to correct the sort of even though Alamut was a fantastic novel as an allegory, as an exploration of power and ideologies and leadership, the historical perspective was very much skewed toward the European side of things. And so this book does a lot to kind of correct that without necessarily praising, Hassan Isaba as this perfect angel, because he most definitely was not. But it definitely presents him in more of a light where you can start to question whether, in his historical context, in his times, those sorts of tactics that he used were necessary. And also there is a lot of myths around him that may or not be. We'll get into that. We'll get into that as we go on. But Samarkand actually follows more principally the story of the Rubaiyat by Omar Khayyam, which I briefly discussed in the last video, and we'll be discussing even more today in connection with this book, because this Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam is also a work and a historical figure, Omar Khayyam, that is shrouded in just as much myth and misinformation from an Occidental perspective, and just the whole story. Like, we don't really have a direct access to any original manuscript of the poetry of Omar Khayyam. Virtually everything Omar Khayyam is credited for, his Rubaiyats, it's questionable whether he even wrote them or not. So there's, just like Hassan Saba, Omar Khayyam is a character that was a real historic character, that is a person that is in historical documents, and he was known as an astronomer and kind of a man of science for his time, but was also mentioned to have written all these poems. So just like Hassan, we have a character that's as much myth as a historical figure, depending on who you talk to. And so Samarkand follows Omar Khayyam through kind of how he gets started writing in poetry. It's a fictional account with a lot of kind of historical exposition, but I really enjoyed it all in the first half. And I will say that I've never read a book where the first half was so good and the second half just completely fell flat for me. So almost all of what I talk about today in this video is going to be the first half of Samarkand, and I'll talk a little bit about why the second half wasn't as good, but they are really almost two books. The first half of the book being about Omar Khayyam and Hassan and the vizier of the Sultan who Hassan in Alamut assassinates, and it's actually one of the main protagonists, the young men that kind of joins the Ismailis at Alamut with Hassan that we follow throughout the book, who Ibn Tahir, who actually is the one who kills the vizier, but of course he's not mentioned at all in Samarkand. It's an unnamed assassin, and some of the events play out a little bit differently. I mean, they're two different fictional accounts of events that we don't know exactly how they played out, but they're just two different visions, right? But it's really hard for me to read Samarkand thinking that Amin Maalouf never read Bartol's Alamut, because it almost feels like a book that's responding directly to Western misconceptions of these historical figures and this historical time. But the part where this book like really hooked me right away was the first meeting between Omar Khayyam and Hassan. Now, I said in the last video they were friends, but really they were kind of just schoolmates in a way, and when they meet, they get along, they have great intellectual conversations, but it's very clear from the beginning, and this carries throughout all the book, that while they have great respect for each other and each other's intelligence, they have very different perspectives on just life and morality and spirituality, and it's really encapsulated by this passage in my edition here on page 63. 2 days later, when they had joined a caravan of merchants, they rode side by side, Omar, Khayyam, and Hassan, quoting from memory in Persian and Arabic large sections of the most beautiful writings of the authors they admired. Sometimes an argument would start up, but then quickly die down. When Hassan spoke of certainties, raised his voice, proclaimed empirical truths, and enjoined his companion to admit them, Omar remained skeptical. He slowly weighed the merits of certain opinions, but seldom settled for any of them, and willingly displayed his ignorance. He found himself repeating, untiringly, "What do you want me to say? These things are veiled, and you and I are on the same side of the veil. When it falls, we will no longer be here." So I, of course, seeing Hassan as quite a terrifying character in Alamut, how he's portrayed, and very much more evil than good. He's much more intricate in this book, but you still, I think that people who are readers and lovers of learning who read this book will find themselves kind of leaning toward one or the other, depending on your life experience. Hassan, who believes in that, pragmatically he can and must and wants to shape the world based on his convictions, which Alamut makes us question if they are even really convictions. But in this book, it does seem that Hassan, there actually are parts of this book that hint at something behind Hassan that Alamut really explored, But so it's not completely absent from Samarkand, but you do get a sense of somebody who's much more, has much stronger convictions about what he's doing, like deep down, right? His faith and everything in Samarkand. But any lover of learning will fall to one or the other. And I, of course, am much more, I feel, on the side of Omar Khayyam and his sort of more absurdist, the way he's portrayed in the book, of course, which everything you say about these characters is entwined in myths and, suppositions, and it's almost impossible to have a conversation about these historic characters without saying something contentious. So it's, I'm always prefacing this with I'm talking about the characters within the book. And the vizier of the Sultan Nizam is also, we see a lot of things from his perspective, and he writes a treatise as well. All of these three are almost portrayed as different kinds of writers and philosophers. And so, Nazim is probably kind of more of the political, just the political guy who doesn't really, he's more of, there's one part where it references, for example, he wrote basically the version of The Prince, of Machiavelli's The Prince, but for Persia, but even better because he actually had power. something like that. So that's a very different perspective than like Hassan's kind of dark, shadowy, will to power sort of thing that he's got going on. And then Omar Khayyam, kind of the absurdist poet who doesn't want power, who rejects power, who just wants, all he asks for is his observatory and his time to pursue his learning and sciences and write his poetry and drink wine. And, he's just here to experience life. And I feel kind of just has more of that absurdist view of things. And language. So this book, why did it actually change some of my viewpoints on Hassan? That's the next thing I wanted to talk about. And that's really important because I feel that if you were only to read Alamut, by Bartol, you'd really be missing out on a whole side of what this character potentially is. So let me just read this passage. So it's talking about how the assassins of Hassan, people were marveled by them because they were so willing to die, for their faith or whatever. So continuing there, they'd hit their target and then they would immediately be captured and tortured or killed. But they accepted that fate so willingly. And we see that in Alamut by Bartol as well. But this is what is written in Maalouf. So unreal were these scenes that it was often said that Hassan's men were drugged. How otherwise could it be explained that they went to their deaths with a smile? Some credence was given to the assertion that they were acting under the influence of hashish, and it was Marco Polo who popularized this idea in the West. Their enemies in the Muslim world would contemptuously call them hashishiyun, or hashish smokers. Some Orientalists thought that this was the origin of the word assassin, which in many European languages has become synonymous with murderer. The myth of the assassins was more terrifying yet. The truth is different. According to texts which have come down to us from Alamut, Hassan liked to call his disciples asasiyun, meaning people who are faithful to the asas, the foundation of the faith. This is the word misunderstood by foreign travelers, which seemed similar to hashish. And it goes on even, to say that Hassan did have a passion for plants and knowledge of their curative, sedative, or stimulative characteristics. He had potions and recipes, which he did have a recipe that stimulated his disciples' minds and rendered them more adept at their studies, which was a mixture of honey, pounded nuts, coriander, and was considered a very agreeable medicine. And then it says, however, we must go by the evidence. In spite of the tenacity and allure of tradition, the assassins had no drug other than straightforward faith, which was constantly reinforced by the intense instruction, the most efficient organization, and the strictest appointment of tasks. So that, even in this introduction to Fitzgerald's The Rubaiyat, we get this sort of completely mistaken view, which I read out loud in the last video. And of course, I'm not deleting the video. These are all here for learning. Like, I think all of my mistakes, and if you can even call them mistakes, every video is just an expression of an idea that I form by reading a certain book. It's not my, this is what I believe 100% true going forward, right? That's the limit of language and YouTube videos. And the value of it is up to you to decide. It's certainly been valuable to me, and most of the value is in what I have never said and will never say in these videos. It's when I reflect on all this after the unsaid things. Those are going to be important. I digress. It doesn't matter. But I will link the last video in this video and this video in the last video, because I really feel they're entirely connected. And continuing here, so Hassan Sabah is a more complicated character than an Alamut, and but he is still very problematic. And as we get further on in the first part of this book, which is the complete story of Omar Khayyam, Hassan, and the Vizier Nazim, it works as its own book basically. So this we do get a perspective of Hassan. I feel that Omar Khayyam sees him as building himself his own prison, and Hassan actually goes so far as assassinating Omar Khayyam's disciple in this story, and stealing his book of poetry, the Rubaiyat, the mythical Rubaiyat that we don't really know if it existed or not, and taking it to Alamut. But Omar Khayyam lets it go. He doesn't go to Alamut, even though they stole his entire volume of poetry in this book. And so there's something kind of that reminds me of I'm sure I'll get some detail wrong here, but those Buddhist mandalas that those monks make, where they spend just like weeks or whatever making, a really long time making these big beautiful mandalas out of stones or whatever it is, and then they just wipe it all clean, right after. It's just the point. Omar Khayyam almost has that sort of like Buddhist, like let's just let it go sort of perspective on it, and lives out the rest of his days. So now I guess I'll talk about why did the second half of the book fall flat. The second half of the book takes place in the modern era, and it's about the man who had a beautiful, bejeweled copy of the Rubaiyat manuscript on his with him while he was on the Titanic, and it was lost when the Titanic went down. And this is something that really happened. It was just a beautiful edition of the Rubaiyat, but I believe it was, from what I dug up, it was just a Fitzgerald translation. It wasn't. There is no original manuscript of the Rubaiyat, from what I can understand. And again, we don't really know if Omar Khayyam actually wrote any of these. Different scholars have said maybe there's a handful that we can be really sure. We know, like, the first one that was actually attributed to him was like 60 years after his death or something like that, which is number 62. Actually, yeah, I want to read that one because it's the one that is most probable to be him. Actually, was it? No, LX2. Yeah, Roman numerals. Yep, 62, right? Okay. Another said, "Why ne'er a peevish boy would break the bowl from which he drank in joy? Shall he that made the vessel in pure love and fancy in an after rage destroy?" That one didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I have to read it again. So it's like, yeah, like even a troublemaker would never destroy something that gave him joy. And so I think it's supposed to, and then the second part is like, so yeah, honestly, I'm not sure. But that is the one that I guess is taken. And again, all these translations by Fitzgerald are like really kind of questionable. And I did go online and find a website where somebody had created literal and meaning translations, so like a translation that was as literal as possible, and then a translation of the meaning, and then tried to match up these quatrains to what Fitzgerald was referencing. And some of them you can't even find. Some of them Fitzgerald like almost completely makes up, and nobody has any idea exactly where he was pulling them from, or he was combining multiple. There's just so many creative liberties taken with this by Fitzgerald. So it's a really, it's a beautiful work that a lot of people in the history of literature have been familiar with, this Rubaiyat by Fitzgerald, but as a faithful reproduction of the original, it probably is not. But then again, even those originals are questionable whether Omar Khayyam wrote them. So if we go back to 62, I wanted to read you the literal. So, yeah, this person said that the literal translation of this would be like, when the clay into a cup is molded, it's breaking, the drunk scolded, many limbs and heads are enfolded, through whose love unfolded, by which degree folded. Wow, okay. So the meaning would be like, the genius that shapes the form is far above the mundane and norm. Clay into life shall transform, back into dust by death's storm. So again, you can, and then it has the Farsi script right there. So you can make of all this what you will. I wouldn't say that's one of like my favorite quatrains in Fitzgerald's Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. But I was thinking about going through and reading some of my favorites now. This is already a video that's probably going to bore some people. I kind of finished with this. So yeah, the second part fell flat for me because it was about this modern guy who loses this manuscript on the Titanic, and I think his story in Persia of how he gets the manuscript and stuff is supposed to mirror the story of Hassan and Omar Khayyam in some ways, and it's supposed to be literary, but I don't know, it was so much less interesting than the first part, and the first part felt like such a complete story that I'm like, you know what, maybe I'll read the second half of this someday, but just the first half is a complete story in itself and worth it. So I'll finish with Samarkand by Amin Maalouf on that note, and just page through the Rubaiyat here and maybe read a few of my favorites. Not too many, I'm not going to go overboard here. Maybe like 3 or 4 or something like that. Oh yeah, there's one in here that actually references Rostam from the Persian Book of Kings. I like this one. Number 26. Think in this battered caravanserai, whose doorways are alternate night and day, how sultan after sultan with his pomp abode his hour or two and went his way. Think about how many sultans have passed under this arch, who have come and gone. And it reminds me actually of a part in Samarkand where Omar Khayyam says something like, you know, there's only a few geniuses like me in every generation, but you know, sultans are a dime a dozen or something like that. You know, I'm paraphrasing heavily there, obviously, but it's, you know, something about this combination of books, the Persian Book of Kings, Shahnameh, even, you know, the Great Kings. There's just this reminder, you know, this complete history of kings, even though they live like 1,000 years. What's the difference between 1,000 years and 100 years, really? And Alamut and Samarkand and the Rubaiyat, it all really got me thinking about like my own mortality in a way that I haven't, not just thinking about it, but feeling it, but really comprehending it and really like starting to struggle with, you know, spiritual questions, and it's like this flood, like all this literature that I've been reading the past 2 years is here for me to draw on and feel comforted that like I'm not the only one who has who has struggled with these things. I'm not the only one who has just looked at my life and asked, like, wow, why, you know, why are we here with no answers? Or, well, the problem is there's too many answers, right? There's too many answers, and none of them are convincing. So I guess I am really like, I relate to Omar Khayyam in the sense that he's just this sort of eternal skeptic. I'll just let that idea trail off there. And again, when I go back and watch these videos, which I'll inevitably do, as you know, when the project ends, that doesn't mean I'll be done like making stuff, but it's not gonna be like this. You know, it's not gonna be like this. And I'm just looking for like another Rubaiyat that I like right now. Up from earth's center through the seventh gate, I rose and on the throne of Saturn sate, in many knots unraveled by the road, by not the knot of human death and fate. And I really like the literal translation to this one, is like, from the depths of earth to the heights of Saturn, we've solved all riddles, turn after turn, break every chain, our ignorance burn, except the riddle that fills the urn. It's like there's always that big mystery that no one has the answer to. There was a door to which I found no key. There was a veil past which I could not see. Some little talk a while of me and thee there seemed, and then no more of thee and me. We come in, we go out. I come in, I go out. Have a good night.